I'm really delighted to be here and always happy to come to the center whenever I have a reason to do so. What I want to do is tell you the story of how the center came to be and how it came to be here. And I would preface it with this comment that in the past, in talking to former fellows, many of them would describe the center as being something of an academic utopia. And I don't know about you, but when I think about utopias and how utopias come to be, what comes to mind is a picture of a planning process and a kind of vision and an insight and a brilliance that informed its conception and ultimately its creation. The story I'm about to tell you bears very little resemblance to that picture. The vision was certainly there, but the depth of detail in the conception and the planning process itself left many things to be desired. And yet somehow, mysteriously, in the midst of all of this and with very unforgiving deadlines bearing down on the planning committee, the center miraculously came into being and opened in September of 1954. Now, inevitably, the story has to begin with Ford Foundation because they were the funders of the center. That foundation was established in 1936, and it was actually created by Edsel Ford, who at that time was head of Ford Motors Company, but clearly under the direction of his father, Henry Ford. And what Edsel Ford did in 1936 was to create a foundation and donated all of $25,000 to fund it. And so it was a quiet, sleepy, unobtrusive, hardly noticed operation that was initially, I believe, in Michigan, and then somewhere I read that they moved to Pasadena for a time before ultimately relocating to New York, where they are now. So it was kind of ticking along. And then Edsel Ford died in 1943 and his father in 1947. And at that point, all of the non-voting stock of Ford Motor Company was suddenly transferred to the foundation. And it made Ford Foundation the largest single foundation anywhere in the world. So it went from this sleepy operation to suddenly this amazingly large and complex foundation. Well, as you can imagine, anybody who could connect whatever it was they were doing to what they thought Ford would be interested in began to knock on their doors, and the trustees of the foundation, the chair of the board at this time was Edsel's son, Henry Ford II. And they had to have a way to screen requests and proposals, and mainly some foundation, some basis for saying no to all of these requests. It's a very familiar problem when foundations suddenly inherit great wealth. And so the board of trustees of the foundation went into something of a panicked scramble trying to figure out how to define what it was the foundation should be about and what it would or would not support. And to that end, a study committee was appointed, and they were assigned the task of basically outlining to the board of trustees, recommending to the board of trustees the kind of areas in which they would be investing. The chair of that committee was a San Francisco lawyer whose name is Rowan Gaither. He's a very, very interesting man. He was a lawyer. He established a law firm here in San Francisco, But that kind of morphed into the first venture capital firm established in the West Coast. And it's a very interesting thing. I didn't know about him until I Googled him to find out a bit more about him. And so he was something of a kind of maverick and a visionary. He was on the board of Ford Foundation. They asked him to basically head up a committee. It was a 7-person committee to figure out what the foundation's mission ought to be. Gaither, by way of background, in addition to being a lawyer, he was also the director of the radiation lab at MIT during the Second World War. He was very instrumental in founding RAND Corporation in Southern California that was a spin-off of Boeing. And what came out of that was a very strong appreciation that he had for the importance and the role of science in informing public policy. And he could see the benefits that the physical sciences had brought to his enterprise during the Second World War. This was inspiring him to try to bring life to RAND Corporation, which he did. But now what he could see was that in working out a mission for Ford Foundation, he was reflecting on the conditions of the first half of the 20th century and the nature of those conditions and the kind of knowledge that would be required in order to address these. So the First World War, the Depression, the Second World War, fascism, the Holocaust, nuclear war, the rebuilding of Europe, the rebuilding of Japan, and he saw that all of these were enterprises that Ford ought to be interested in, but to be interested in them, what they would have to do is embellish the social and behavioral sciences because that would be the wellspring of knowledge, he imagined, that would be necessary for the foundation to address these problems. And Gaither, incidentally, from 1953 to 56, became president of Ford Foundation. So he was in kind of thick and heavy with the foundation, a very influential figure there. Okay, so the committee deliberated, the 7-person committee deliberated. And what they did was they identified 5 areas that they said the foundation would now invest in. And areas 1 through 4 basically reflected the interests of members of the Board of Trustees and key staff people up to that point. And they basically involved education, promoting peace, promoting freedom, promoting economic well-being. I mean, these were the general areas. But what he did was he identified a 5th area, and the 5th area was going to be to support the development of basic research and theory in the social and the behavioral sciences. Right? Now, he made that recommendation to the trustees, and they said, what? What are you talking about? That's not what we're about. But he prevailed because he really could see how fundamentally important this was, and he had a real, apparently a real appreciation for how underdeveloped our enterprises actually were. And so he prevailed, and he convinced them to fund this Area 5, even against the kind of skepticism of people on his board. Well, the people who were enthusiastic about the first 4 areas formed these coalitions between people on the board and staff members. And of course, they grabbed the lion's share of the money, leaving only a small amount for this Area 5, relatively small amount. But because Gaither persisted, he was able to squirrel that off. So he convinced them to do that, and then for his good works, they made him chairman of a committee to now say, okay, so flesh this out. What should it look like? And there were 2 other people on the committee. One was Hans Speyer. Some of you may know Hans Speyer is a sociologist who immigrated from Berlin in 1933. He came to New York and founded what was then called the University of Exile, which ultimately became the New School for Social Research. By the time all this was happening, Speyer had now left New York and gone to Rand Corporation, and was on the staff of Rand. And the other was Donald Marquis. He is a social psychologist from Michigan, and he and Hans Speyer and Gaither together sat down to try to flesh out what would this Area 5 look like. Now, the committee first deliberated, and the dates become very important here because it will give you some idea of how rapidly things unfolded. They met for the first time the end of January of 1951, and they sat down and basically said, so what should we do? And they floated all kinds of ideas. One was that they were going to create a series of institutes of some unspecified nature scattered around the country that would support social and behavioral scientists doing research. That was one idea. Another idea was that they were going to give the money to the United Nations in order to strengthen it without ever specifying exactly how and in what ways. But they also realized that because these ideas that they had were so vague and ill-defined that they really needed to access better expertise. And so they identified a panel of experts whose names I'm sure many of you will recognize. It included Ernest Hilgard, who was at the time professor of psychology at Stanford, Robert Merton, who I'm sure you know from Columbia, Robert Sears, who was a professor of psychology at Harvard at the time, and Herb Simon, who was at that time at Carnegie Mellon. And basically they became a panel of experts that Gaither and his small subcommittee would consult. And they also agreed that they needed to have somebody who would be appointed as a full-time member of the staff in order to work on this. And here the idea was that everybody else at Ford in these other 4 areas had staff people who were advocating on behalf of those areas, and Area 5 didn't have somebody on site. So they agreed we've got to get somebody who will champion this within the foundation. I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, so the planning group, that was the result of their January meeting. They had a meeting in late February and then another one in late April. And there was still no definition for what this Area 5 enterprise was going to be about. But in April, they made the decision to hire a staff person who turned out to be Bernard Berelson. Now, Berelson was, at the time, roughly 40 years old. He had gotten a degree from Chicago's Graduate Library School, and somewhere I read that he had for a time been dean there, but I can't really confirm that. However, during the Second World War, Berelson had been working with Hans Speyer. And then, following the end of the war, from 1944 to 46, he went to New York and he joined the staff of the Bureau of Applied Social Research at Columbia, which was headed by Paul Lazarsfeld. And Berelson became the champion on the staff of Ford Foundation of this Area 5, and he undertook to kind of advance and shape and form the vision for what this place would be about. Well, because he had been at the Bureau of Applied Social Research, he immediately formed an alliance with Paul Lazarsfeld, or more accurately, Lazarsfeld formed an alliance with him, and I'll explain that in a minute. And of course, once Lazarsfeld got involved, now Merton gets into this more deeply than he had before. Now, it turned out that Lazarsfeld, prior to all of these developments, beginning in 1949, came up with the idea that what he wanted to do was to create what he said would be a new professional school, a school that would train recently minted PhDs in the social and behavioral sciences and make real researchers out of them. And he, of course, had in mind the idea that this would be located at Columbia. Well, when word got out that Area 5 was going to be funded, Lazarsfeld went into an even higher gear than he was accustomed to operating at. And he initially had prepared something like a 9 or 10-page document in 1949. By 1950, this had grown to more than 50 pages, and by the time Berelson was hired, this thing was over 100 pages and now co-authored by Robert Merton. So Lazarsfeld had been kind of shopping this idea around the Ford Foundation when Berelson was hired in the summer of 1951. He immediately contacted Berelson, and together the two of them began to try to figure out how to bring shape to this Area 5 in ways that would accord with what Lazarsfeld had in mind in creating this professional school. Now, again, when you read the documents about this, it's really pretty striking how vague the ideas were. I mean, they knew they wanted to create this entity, but what this entity would do and how it would operate wasn't clear. But they did agree on a couple of points. One is that it had to be near or at a major university, that it would be a professional school for social and behavioral scientists where they could come to get additional training. The idea was going to be that there would be two categories of fellows. There would be senior fellows. There were going to be 4 senior fellows. This was going to be funded, Lazarsfeld proposed, for a 5-year period. There would be 4 senior fellows, sort of the titans of the field, one of whom was going to be Paul Lazarsfeld. Then there would be, in addition, a provision made for 5 to 6 additional senior people who would come for lesser periods of time. So these 4 senior people would come for a full 5-year period. Then the second category would come from 6 months to 2 years. And then there would be 30 to 35 of the best young postdocs they could identify in the relevant fields, which included right from the very beginning not only the social and behavioral sciences, but the humanities as well. And then all of this, meantime, these senior researchers were going to have research staff assigned to them so that they could continue to do their research. And finally, they said, Lazarsfeld realized that it was probably not in the works to insist that the thing be located at Columbia, and so the agreement was that it was going to be somewhere in the East Coast, which meant Boston, New Haven, New York, Princeton, Philadelphia, maybe Baltimore, but that was about it. And that was what they had in mind and always assumed that's where it would be. Okay, so they present this report to the board, and the board says, okay, now what we want you to do is write a concrete proposal and present this to us. The presentation was going to be made in June of 1952. And a committee was created now to write the proposal, and it included Bob Merton, Harold Laswell, Sam Stouffer, and Ralph Tyler, who had been drawn into it, I believe, probably because he was at Chicago and Berelson's contact with Chicago may have played a role there. And it was this committee, incidentally, that actually came up with the name that we have today of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. They drew up their proposal. They presented it to the foundation in June of 1952. And they asked the board to take formal action on it, which they did, and they approved it. Now, here's what they approved. First of all, they were going to fund this annually to the tune of $650,000 a year, which, as Stephen can tell you even now, is a handsome sum. So it's really quite a lot of money. They asked that a board of trustees be appointed, and I'll get back to that in a minute. They asked that a director be named, and that the board of trustees and the director would then be responsible for naming the 4 senior fellows, this other class of senior scholars, and the 30 to 35 junior fellows who were going to be invited. And the idea was that the board would do all of this. Now, mind you, we are now in the summer of 1952. The board would do all of this by February of 1953, and the center would open in September of 1953. That was the plan, okay? So the board of Ford approved this in June of 52 and voted to fund it for 5 years. And the understanding was this was going to be located in the east. And and one other provision, of course, was they had to find a site. Okay, so they said, okay, we're going to open in September of 1953. We're going to have all these people arrive. You have to find a site for this, appoint a board, appoint a director, appoint the fellows, and so on. Now, there were 2 things implicit in the whole design of the center, one of which has gotten intimately interwoven into the basic DNA of the place, and that is interdisciplinarity. Gaither and others realized that in order to really take on the kind of problems that they thought they would be addressing, it was going to be necessary to draw on the expertise of a range of disciplines, so the understanding was always from the beginning that it would be this rich mix of disciplines, and that has remained true all through the history of the center. The other idea, which didn't survive, is this, that they had in mind the idea that if you got together all of this kind of expertise and got them around a table and they started talking to each other, somehow or the other, what was going to bubble up was some grand unified theory of the social and behavioral sciences that would be our counterpart to the grand unified theory that physicists were then saying they had. And from the beginning, that was part of the impulse of this, but of course, as you know well, that all dropped by the boards and in a hurry because that was not going to happen. All right, so that was the plan. That's what the board foundation approved. So what happened? Well, first of all, it opened a year late because they realized in June of 1952, oh my God, we only have a year to put this whole thing together. So they put it off to September of 1954. For reasons I'll get into in a minute, they got bogged down on the issue of where it would be sited and looked all over the East Coast and ended up out here. This distinction between senior and junior fellows went by the boards. There was only one class of citizen, and that was fellow, and every fellow got exactly the same benefits and perks and so on. There were no permanent appointments. There were no appointments that would extend beyond a year. And above all, Lazarsfeld's cherished idea that somehow you would bring all these people together to work at the feet of these giants never came to pass. And so what materialized was something that was altogether different from what the foundation had actually approved. Now, in its place, what emerged was a kind of modus operandi that's very interesting, that it fell into place almost instantly and has remained a central part of the center's culture ever since. And I believe it came about primarily because of the genius of the founding director, Ralph Tyler, who basically, instead of telling scholars what it was that they should be doing and how they should be operating and so on. I mean, he had, after all, been Dean of the School of Education and been around the University of Chicago for a long time, and he knew that the one thing you can never do with an academic is tell them what they should be doing. That's And he learned that very quickly. So instead of doing that, he asked them, what conditions do you need that would best advance your work? And then began to piece together a kind of culture and system of operation that was responsive to what these really smart young people were telling him they needed to have in order to advance their own work. And all of that gave rise to the features of the fellowship program you're familiar with, the freedom of time to pursue projects of your own making, bringing people together here all at one time and so that they form a community and a cohort and go through the experience together. Deeply interdisciplinary in its character, and all of the people who are here are not only involved as resources for each of you to draw on, but they themselves are resources involved in creating creative enterprises themselves. So it's part of the magic of the place. Now, you know about the accomplishments of the center, and so I don't propose to brag, or at least brag for very long. It's pretty impressive, and all you need do is walk around and look at the lists of the ghosts in the studies and see the range of people who have been here over the years to understand that it became a place where people then beginning their careers in the social and behavioral sciences really realized this was the place to be. This was where the action was. One thing I want to point out about this, because during the time that I was the associate director, I was regularly beat over the head and shoulders by people who said, how in the hell are you selecting fellows? And, you know, what's the selection about? And it's kind of hard. There's a lot of rhyme or reason to it, but it was very hard to explain that coherently to people because it's a very complicated system. So in my own defense, I will take just a minute to point something out. If you look at the fellows who've been here over the years, there have been 23 Nobel laureates. There have been 14 Pulitzer Prize winners, 44 recipients of MacArthur Genius Awards, 12 recipients of Clark Medals, 20 who are National Book Award Prize winners, 21 recipients of the National Science Medal, and several hundred members of the National Academies, and so on. Now, the important point I want to make here is that none of these people had, except for the Nobel Prizes, 3 of the 24 Nobel Prizes were awarded before the scholar came here, but in every other case, all these prizes were awarded after the fellowship year. And that's by way of saying that whatever the board of directors and the directors were doing, by finding and identifying talent, it seems to me that they did a pretty effective job of it. And so if you look particularly at the Clark Medals, that, as you may know, is an award given to an economist every other year for an economist under the age of 40. It's a very prestigious medal, and all 14 recipients had been fellows picked out by the trustees as promising comers in advance of their actually receiving that. And of course, as I mentioned, that, you know, if you look at the list of scholars, it's pretty impressive. The first class of fellows, there were only 36, and I'll explain why that was the case in a minute. But it included people like Harold Laswell, Paul Lazarsfeld, Charles Lindblom, Duncan Luce, Al Hasdorf, Sandy Dornbush, Franz Alexander, Kenneth Boulding, Elsie Frankel Brunswick, Clyde Kluckholm. I mean, that's a pretty, you'd like to have that as your departmental roster any day of the week. And in the next year, it included Yuri Bronfenbrenner, Jim Coleman, Robert Dahl, Shmuel Eisenstadt, Leon Festinger, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, Alex Inkelis, Alfred Kroeber, Gardner Lindsay, who was actually a fellow 3 times before he finally came back as director, Marty Lipset, Jim March, Jim Morgan, Wally Stegner, Pat Supes. I mean, it's really an astonishing, and bear in mind that the majority of these people were young scholars at the time who were recently minted PhDs. So there you are. And it would be hard, I won't try to review this, but if you looked at the development, the major developments that have happened in the social and behavioral sciences over the course of the period when the center has been in existence, you would find that the center played an absolutely pivotal role in a wide variety of different fields, ranging all the way from primate studies and the study of cetaceans at one end to the philosophy and history of science at the other. So it's really been very impressive. Now, so how did it end up here? Well, to answer that, what I need to do is start with the board of directors. The full roster is listed on a panel on the entrance there, you can see. But it included Frank Stanton, who was president of CBS, Paul Buck, who was the provost of Harvard, Frosty Hill, who was the provost of Cornell, Bob Merton, Robert Sears, who, as I say, at the time was at Harvard, Alan Waterman, who was the director of the National Science Foundation, and Clark Kerr, who was chancellor of UC Berkeley. And as I indicated in the agreement that the foundation had, what they said was that it was going to be located somewhere in the East. Now, this is where time became a really big factor, because they realized, okay, you know, in a year we have to put this whole thing together, including finding a site, so we can't go about building a new building. What we have to do is look at existing facilities and find one that will be suited to the purpose of the center. And these deliberations didn't actually begin until early in 1953. And so a committee of staff members of Ford Foundation started scurrying around the East Coast, going from Boston all the way down to Baltimore, trying to find vacated buildings that would be suitable to the center. And they identified 100 of these. These got screened down, and they ended up identifying 14 that they thought were potential candidates. 4 were in New York, 4 in Philadelphia, 4 in Boston, and the 2 remaining were elsewhere. One I know was in Easton, Pennsylvania, of all places. And I think the 14th one may have been in Baltimore, but I'm not absolutely sure. So now the board starts deliberating. Well, if you think about the composition, what's going to happen is that anybody who becomes a proponent of locating it in a place that they would want is automatically going to invite opposition from everybody else. And they simply could not come to an agreement about where to locate it. They thought at one point that they actually had a place. It was going to be in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. And what happened is the building itself would have been all right, I gather. However, they scheduled a site visit for a day early in September when it was hot and muggy. And this building was unventilated, unair conditioned. They trundled around. It was a 4-story building, and they trundled around. They said, this is not going to get the job done. And so that one fell by the boards. Now, right in this context, Robert Sears becomes really critical, because he suggests to the board that maybe they ought to expand their horizons and think about locating the center somewhere on the West Coast. Now, I said that Sears was involved in all of this from the very beginning. At the time of his initial involvement, including becoming appointed a member of the board, he was on the faculty of Harvard. However, he had gone to Stanford as an undergraduate, and in 1953, he was lured back by the president of Stanford, who was then Wallace Stirling, to come back and build up psychology to make it into a world-class department. And he came back in 1953. Eventually, he became dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences. One of the people instrumental in his appointment was Fred Terman. Now, you may know that Terman was an electrical engineer. He came to Stanford in 1925 as chair of the electrical engineering department, and he was charged with responsibility for building that department into a world-class operation. Eventually, he became the dean of the School of Engineering, and then just shortly after Sears arrived, he became provost. So he was right in the middle. Well, how did Terman go about doing this? Well, what he did was to scan the country for people, initially in electrical engineering, who he thought would be really top-notch people to recruit. And he would arrange for them to come and spend a year as a visiting scholar in the engineering department, and they would spend the year and they'd get smitten by the West Coast, and then he'd send them back to Kansas or Minnesota or wherever they came from, and long about January he'd get in touch with them saying, have you ever thought about relocating? And he was just picking them off, low-hanging fruit. And he was actually able to do this not just for electrical engineering, but he built up the whole engineering school, laid the foundations for it, for what its world-class status today. Well, this gave Sears an obvious model, but what he realized is that his task would be a lot easier because he didn't have to invite anybody to be a visiting scholar. They were all going to become, the people he would most want to hire were all going to be fellows here at the center. And so what you could do is conduct a courtship without anybody calling it that. And that's exactly what happened. And Sears eventually, when he became dean, was able to build up all of the social and behavioral science departments at Stanford into the world-class operations they are. Now, in the period of time when I was the associate director, there was never a year in which one or usually several members of the class didn't end up following that pattern Terman had established. That is, they'd go back to wherever they came from, and a year or two later, lo and behold, they show up on the masthead of the faculty of the relevant department here at Stanford. It's difficult to get exact figures on this, so don't quote these as being exact, but they're approximations and they certainly reflect pretty well what has happened. Right now, there are 200 members of the Stanford faculty who are former fellows of the center. Upwards of a third of them were not Stanford faculty when they were fellows. So you can see how all of this has happened. Okay, so you see what Sears was up to and why he saw this as such a precious resource. Okay, but then how did he arrange for it to come here? Well, the Board of Trustees kept meeting. And in February of 1953, they had actually issued invitations to the entering class for September of 1954. It's just that they couldn't tell people where it was they would be going. As I say, members of the board kind of ground each other down. And what became very apparent to Sears, but also most importantly to Ralph Tyler, is that this would never get resolved if you tried to locate it in the East Coast. It just wouldn't. And so Tyler was very receptive to the idea of looking at locations here in the West Coast. And so Tyler and Bob Sears and Clark Kerr now formed a subcommittee to start looking at sites out here. And incidentally, I should say that what's interesting is that when this proposal was originally made to the Board of Trustees of the Center, it was sort of received very coolly. It was almost dismissed because how can you have serious academic work being done in a place with beaches, for God's sake? You can't do that. And the idea would be, it had to be that you needed cold, wintry weather to get serious work done. And so the idea of California just struck them as very strange. But on the other hand, they admired Sears and couldn't dismiss it out of hand, and so that's how it stayed on the agenda. So Sears and Clark Kerr and Ralph Tyler started going around Northern California, this Bay Area, looking at sites. They looked at one in San Francisco on 19th Street in San Francisco. They looked at one in Millbrae, in Belmont, in Atherton, in Menlo Park. They found one actually in Hillsborough. Hillsborough is equidistant between San Francisco and Palo Alto. And there was an abandoned estate, and it looked like it would be ideal, but in order to put the center there, they had to get a zoning variance from the zoning board of Hillsborough, and they didn't like the idea of beady-eyed empiricists walking around on their sidewalks at night, and so they turned it down. And so there they were. Now time is really running out. And right in this context, Sears goes to talk to Terman and says, isn't there a place around Stanford where we could put it? And Terman said, yeah, there is. The Lathrop estate, which is here, known as Alta Vista. Lathrop was Jane Stanford's brother and had been, I think, treasurer or an official of the university. They built a house up here. It was a 3-story house. It was rather spacious. And Terman said, you can have it for $1 a year. And so at this point, the trustees were absolutely desperate because they were now within 9 months of welcoming the entering class. And so it was really white knuckle time. And so in this context, Clark Kerr said, look, I have an architect on the faculty of the School of Architecture at Berkeley, William Worcester, and I can get him to come down and inspect the site. He will tell us what kind of renovations need to be done and do it. And so in February of '54, Worcester came down. He looked at this house and he said, this is ridiculous. This house is in desperate need of massive renovation. And because it's a 4-story building, it would mean that the renovations would have to be done sequentially by different categories of workers, and that was just going to take forever to do it. So in March of 1954, he met with the board, and he delivered his report. I will now quote from that report. They asked him what he thought about that house. He said, tear the damn thing down. Build the motel type of 1-story thing so much used in California. This will enable hundreds of workmen to be on the site and not in each other's ways, while if you remodel, each trade waits on the other in an intricate structure of many floors. And anyway, who would want to be up 3 or 4 floors in a hot attic to hear the pecking of the typewriter through the wooden floors below? So they said, but this is March of '54, and these people are supposed to arrive in September. And he said, I can do this. He said, and again I'm quoting, he said, okay, here it is, the 6th of March. We'll have bids in 6 weeks, start building in 2 months, 4 months building, and we'll complete it in 6 months. And actually, construction didn't actually begin until May the 17th of 1954. And they finished not the whole campus, but the upper level of campus in time to welcome the class in that year. And so that's the story of how it ended up here. It's kind of an interesting story because what materialized bore little relationship to what the Ford trustees had approved, but on the other hand was remarkably responsive to the demands and the needs of the sciences and the disciplines that would be represented here. Now, let me just make one final comment here. Whenever I talk with former fellows, mostly what they want to know is, has the center changed? That's what they always ask me. And I sometimes think that if we had a motto, it might be death before change or something like that, because they have this idyllic experience and they don't want a single hair to be put out of place. But what I've realized in talking to them is that there's an erroneous assumption in their thinking. And that is, they've always assumed that the center has always been exactly the way it was in the year that they were there. And they're wrong. That's not true. The mission has remained the same. But there have been fundamental changes that have been made with every successive new management team that's come up, which has to be responsive to the demands of academic life, to the demands of the disciplines that are required, and above all, God knows, to financial contingencies of funding it. And I point that out because when people hear about change taking place at the center, they throw up their hands and say, oh my God, the lights are going out. And that's just, they've always been going out. There have been really fundamental, important changes that have taken place with each successive generation of leadership, and it's important to keep that in mind, because otherwise it makes the already difficult job of our director that much more difficult. And with that, I'll take questions.